Like Francesca said, I'm mostly a consultant these days, and I've been always toying with academia. So I've had a bit of a research practice and lecturing practice, but mostly working with governments and with donors to make sure that what happens on the ground also speaks to what the vision is globally in terms of transboundary conservation. So the presentation that I've made for you today really stems from years of work, and particularly comes out of a gap that I saw in my last project, which was done for the Southern African Development Community, to create a monitoring and evaluation framework for their Transboundary Conservation Areas program. A framework that was able to look both at the global level and at the local levels, and also in between the regions. So what are the priorities of the regions? What are the priorities for TFCAs that already exist? And through this framework set the pace for what the future is to come. And before I actually got to the framework, they had me do a very interesting exercise, which was to create a situation analysis report of monitoring and evaluation frameworks for any transboundary conservation initiative in the world. And it was very challenging because I wanted to produce something that put things into a context. And of course, having been playing around with lawyers and with the legal tools that we have for many years now, I've decided to put it into a legal framework and really look at what is the legislation, what is the framework internationally that talks about transboundary conservation initiative, and how does it perceive that as happening in the ground. So coming out of that is this presentation. I'm not going to tell you too much about it because otherwise I'm going to spoil the finale. But thank you for your interest, and I hope you'll enjoy it. And please do not feel shy at the end to ask any questions. I've got today to discuss this with you, so let's try and make the most of it. So you see from the title, it's about projecting transboundary conservation into the future. You already see that there is a quandary there. Why does transboundary conservation need to be projected into the future? Where, as far as I'm concerned, primarily to make it relevant. And to make it relevant globally, it means that we need to talk about transboundary conservation as an instrument for creating an enabling environment for things to happen in a context of peace building. So researchers before me have framed this as environmental peace building. I have a bit of a problem with that because I tend to see little green helmets going around and doing things in different countries, but it's not like that, and I don't want to put it that way. I want to put it more into a process, and that's exactly what I'm going to take you through. A process of understanding about what is transboundary conservation, about what does it mean to deal with issues of borders and peace, and like Francesca said, most of the examples that I'll talk to you about are about international borders. And it is unfortunate that although at the very beginning in 2001, when the first IUCN guidelines for transboundary conservation came out, they talked about borders as any border separating people or separating governance systems, so including internal borders, like you have between England and Scotland, for instance. But the new guidelines that came out in 2015, and it's a student of mine, Emma, from Italy, who noticed that and very aptly took out that sphere entirely, which in my mind is a great loss, because it implies that at country level we have sorted everything out, and we haven't. And we see that more and more in a European context. So then we talk about what is a transboundary conservation law, and that comes out of my work, as I told you. And then we talk about where is next, where do we want to go next, and that is the future we want part. What is that we want to achieve and how are we going to do it? And that's my little two-penny worth of understanding and suggestions, and I'd like to see your opinion of that, especially because you're all law students. I'm not. I'm just a law interested party. So before we go into the core of the debate, we talk about what is conservation. And now, because I'm in a legal context, I go back to the law, and the only real treaty that tells me what is conservation is the Convention on Biological Diversity. So that convention tells me that in situ conservation, and I'm not going to go into the debate between in situ and ex situ, it's the conservation of ecosystem and natural habitats. So that brings me joy because it talks about conservation as a process, as a functioning process. We need to maintain a system that functions in order to create the enabling environment for species, all species to function. And unfortunately, the CBD doesn't include humans in that sort of category of species. But we talk about ecosystems as a functional unit, and we know that as humans we are part of the ecosystems. And then we talk about sustainable use, and sustainable use involves the existence of human beings and how they relate to natural resources overall, so from water to land and to wildlife and flora. So this is what the CBD says conservation is, and I like that. I like that as a starting point because it already tells me that conservation is not an end goal, but it's a process. And because it's a process, it needs to be localized and it needs to be adaptive. It needs to look at what is there and what we're trying to do in a locality. So we need a broader framework, but we also work locally. So from here, we go into what is transboundary conservation. So if you read the 2015 guidelines, for the first time there is appearance of a 1932 treaty, the European treaty that binds together two countries for the protection of shared natural resources. And that's the Krakow Protocol. But historically, everybody will agree that the first real example of transboundary conservation is the WatertonGlacier Peace Park between the US and Canada. How did that come about? It's a very interesting story. It came about because of a meeting, a cross-border meeting of two Rotary clubs, the one in Canada and the one in the USA. They met in this wonderful environment of the Waterton Glacier, and after a couple of beers they decided that this was a wonderful, wonderful example of nature and it was worth preserving for the future generation to commemorate the peaceful relations between these two countries. So conservation, a symbol, a natural symbol of peace. And so the first Transboundary Conservation Initiative wasn't about conservation as such. It was about celebrating a peaceful process, an amicable process between two countries. And that's why, even though when I started to work in transboundary conservation areas in Southern Africa, that was in the early 2000s, it was starting up as a process, I immediately dismissed as a researcher the idea of peace. I dismissed it because I could see that it wasn't working in that context. It might have been a drive between the two countries at national level, but at local level, there was certainly no peace and conflicts was rife. It was rife because conservation was an additional land use that was now impacting on what was already happening on the ground, and people were unsure about having in their own landscape, in their own backyard, wildlife species that were potentially damaging their livelihoods. We're talking about rural landscapes, we're talking about people with fields. And so to bring in elephants, to bring in predators, is a danger to the livelihoods. And so that was conflict ripening. And I dismissed that. Now, 20 years on almost, we're now in 2018, I go back to it. And I go back to it because after 10 years, I can see that even though we still have conflict on the ground, which is driven by several factors, we have an underlying process, which is that of bringing people together. And somehow, somewhat, even through these conflicts, it's coming out. It's coming out in Southern Africa and it's coming out in other parts of the world, including Europe, and that's the sort of comparative, comparison that I'm bringing to you today. So what do we learn really in transboundary conservation from the Waterton Glacier is, of course, that the first example was about peace, not about conservation of natural resources as such, but also that it was born rather by accident. And having been born by accident, in fact, it took quite 30 years, I think, to really take place throughout the world as a practice in conservation. So, of course, it came out in the 1930s. In America, we were just coming out of the Great Depression, so there was great hope for the future. At the same time, in Europe, we were going down the drain with the beginning of the dark period of Europe and the beginning of the Second World War. So, two different stories. And it probably is no wonder that it took so long for then Transfrontier Conservation to take place in Europe and then eventually in the other countries, because we know very well what happened in Africa at the end of the Second World War, the whole decolonization process, and several countries at conflict, in civil conflict or in international conflict. So my question is right now that I think we need to understand what is peace if we want to make transfrontier conservation areas relevant in that context. And perhaps in talking about peace, it's the only way that we can make transfrontier conservation relevant right now in our way going forward. So I took a lot of time recently, and mainly because I was challenged by this talk, to look at what is peace. And I found a very interesting publication which is called The Natural History of Peace. And in that I've learned several things. I've learned that there is a difference between what we call a man, and I'm not trying to be gender biased here, I'm just sort of man as in men and women, and what is humanity. And sometimes the two don't go together. So we struggle to identify peace as an opposite to something, so normally an opposite to war or to conflict. But I think it would be self-dooming, and several other researchers confirm that, to just consider peace as the absence of war. We know that politicians have said it several times. Even Ronald Reagan, God bless him, said that peace is not the absence of war. But he saw peace as a means to achieve something else. Whereas other speakers, like Martin Luther King, said that peace was a process to achieve itself. And meaning, therefore, that peace is something that is not static, it changes, and it has to change and adapt to what we see as a future. So I'll bring you here a quote from a researcher called Sponsel, and she identified peace as a dynamic process that leads to relative conditions of absence of direct and indirect violence. So we know that if we have peace, we can't have violence, or specifically organized violence. But we also need other elements. We need freedom, we need equality, we need economic and social justice, we need cooperation and harmony. Now, I would like to have the time to have a round here and ask you, when do you think this was written? I'll tell you, it was written in the early 90s. And if you think about the process that the world has engaged in, the politics of this world have engaged in since then, until now, we see that this quote is still very relevant, and we need to still learn a lot from this quote. More recently, I don't know if you actually read this or not, but a politician put this into political words, and that's Ban Ki-moon. I'll leave you to read it, but I would like to pay attention to this last 3 lines. We are challenged today. That was in 2014. We are challenged today because we're trying to promote peace. This was at sort of an opening gathering of a UN meeting to discuss peace and peace building. Because we try to promote peace, but actually we promote war. We promote war by doing several things, by building an army, by building a discourse that is divisory, by promoting conflict as the only way to conflict resolution. So it is important for me to note this because, again, since 2014, nothing much has changed. Although if you look at the global indexes for war, they'll tell you that there are much less conflicts right now in this world than there were 2 years ago. It doesn't seem that way, but then again, perhaps these things are more about perception than they are about reality. But if we are really talking about peace building, we said it's a process. It involves several things. It involves society. It's a societal change. It involves politics. Politics needs to change. It involves even economics. The economics needs to change. And it involves the environment. I was very interested to find in one of my researches that in 2006, the German government commissioned a study on the role of environment in building conflicts and resolving conflicts. And the author, Carius, brought to the attention the fact that the question of environment as a source of conflict was already pointed out in the early 80s. By the same token, the issue of environment as a peace resolution mechanism was also brought out in the 1980s. So this tells me that environment peace building is a matter of choice. Where do we want to go? Do we want to go towards peace or do we not? And do we see the environment as an element of peace or not? In my mind it is, and that's why I keep on working for Transfrontier Conservation areas, and that's the focus of my talk to you today. So we talk about environmental peace building. I go back in time again a little bit, just to say that according to archaeological and paleontological studies, and to put it very bluntly in the words of one researcher, it is the creation of a state, and specifically a nation state, that brought war and conflict into society. So you see already the problem that we have right now. We are in a world where nation states are still the primary objective of politics, the maintenance of a nation state, and the equilibriums within that, whilst we try to promote peace. But if it is true that the nation state was the cause of organized violence because they need an army to maintain themselves, they need an army to resolve conflicts, then where are we going? Are we really serious about the peace building? And so perhaps the environment can pose that solution. We talk about environmental issues all the time. We talk about climate change. We talk about conflicts over water, scarcity of water. So we need to talk about how we work together to make sure that environmental, what we call ecosystem goods and services, can help us sustain life in this planet, including our lives as humans, of course, unless we decide to commit global suicide and then we don't move anywhere forward. So we need to start talking about these issues, and environmental issues can bring about cooperation, as they've done so starting from the WatertonGlacier, a peace park, all the way to now, where we have plenty of examples around the world of where countries at war have started just to talk about shared environmental problems and how to resolve them, to initiate or to foster already existing peace processes. So environment can be a driver of peace building. And so we look at law. What are the critical legal treaties that talk about cooperation, interstate cooperation, to resolve environmental conflicts or to foster the production of environmental goods and services? I can't remember the name now, but an author in a book that came out a couple of years ago on Transboundary Conservation and Biodiversity mentioned the big five of conservation and big five legal instruments of conservation. These are 4 of them. I specifically left out one, that is CITES. I left out CITES, which is the Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species, for 2 specific reasons. First of all, it's not a conservation treaty, no matter what they say or don't say, or they do or don't do. It's not a conservation treaty, it's a trade treaty. And that's its space, and that's what it should be. Secondly, because in my mind and in my experience over the years, it has actually brought more conflict around environmental issues than it has brought about resolutions. And so, in my mind, it's not a treaty that will bring about peace, it will bring about conflict if it carries on the way it is. So, we focus on these 4. The first one was UNESCO. How amazing is it? The first treaty that talked about transboundary environmental conservation was a treaty about culture. But in that, in protecting the heritage, it had 2 programs. It had the Man and Biosphere program, and it had the World Heritage program. And in both of these programs, there is a space for creating transboundary natural resource management agreement. So for 2 states or more to come together to talk about a shared resource, which is a Man and Biosphere reserve or a World Heritage site, to talk about how to protect it, to create the enabling environment, legal and otherwise, to make sure that this protection happens. Then, of course, we have the 3 real conservation ones, which are the Convention of Wetlands, the Ramsar Convention, the CMS, migratory species, which is interesting because being migratory species, the cooperation can happen not just between 2 neighboring states, but between 2 states that are very far apart, but share a species of wildlife that migrates in both countries. So it's interesting how it brings a new element to international cooperation. And then, of course, the Convention on Biological Diversity. So these are this is the legal framework, the critical legal framework that is mandatory, I would say, for the lack of a better term, because right now it escapes me. But people, signatory parties to this, have to implement these treaties. It's not just a framework document, it's not just a declaration or a soft law mechanism. So we've had this instrument since the 1970s. We've had national parks created in all the countries of this planet. Sometimes they cooperate, sometimes they don't. But in essence, we have plenty of examples of conservation. But what is happening now that I can see, it's a sort of anachronism of conservation. Because on the one hand, we have the legal instruments that tell us that we need to have an ecosystemic approach. We need to look at ecosystem, goods and services. It needs to be a natural system that functions for the benefits of wildlife, whether it is fauna or flora, and for the benefits of humans, for the benefits of water, for the benefits of land. We need to have an ecosystemic approach. That's what the treaties say. We need to have a species-based conservation only when it is required for the successful management of the ecosystem. Meaning you can't protect a species to the detriment of everything else. It's just not sustainable. We have a concept of carrying capacity. You remember in the definition that I gave you from the CBD before, a carrying capacity. We need to understand that when we do conservation, it is within a confined space. So even in terms of transfrontier conservation areas, they become multi-land use systems, where you have the protected area, where you have the private sector protected area or a game reserve, where you have just people living on the outskirts. And all of these systems in transboundary conservation need to function together. And in order to do so, there is a carrying capacity for the environment. So we need to manage that. We need to be able as scientists to look at what is there and how to best manage it, and to be adaptable to the changes that occur in any given system, locally and globally, climate change being one of the major drivers. We also know that we need to respect all the actors involved. Governments need to respect everybody, all the stakeholders. There's no stakeholder more stakeholder than others. Everybody is the same, even though sometimes they don't have the same style of communication, be it because of language, be it because of ability to speak and ability to interaction. So we need to respect these. But the conservation in practice, and especially in Southern Africa, it's a totally different discourse. And in fact, it's anachronistic, because even though we had researchers like Dan Brockington that talked to us about the dangers of what he called fortress conservation, we're moving backwards to it. We're moving backwards to a style of conservation that says this is a natural resource area, hands off. There's no use. There's no management that is informed by sciences. There is just whatever suits the lobbying group of the day. And that means that we're going backwards and we're not moving towards an ecosystemic approach. We're actually making conservation irrelevant for a lot of the people that have to live with the conservation strategies that are not sustainable. So as Francesco said, I work a lot in Southern Africa. In a rural context, to live next to a protected area poses risks and threats. And the fact that the people that are the victims, in a way, of these threats are not brought into the table, are not respected as interlocutor, is a problem. And it brings about conflict. So in that respect, conservation is not bringing anything to the peace process. We need a new approach. Or we need to go back to what the law says. And that is my contentions. The law identifies conservation much as in this, I'm bringing it to you again for a reason. The law says that conservation is an all-inclusive process, much like peace. It's a process, and it needs to include several actors, and it needs to bring several other drivers in order to be successful. So how can transboundary conservation help conservation to become relevant again? I think it can help very much, because it forces you to think ecosystemically. In a transboundary conservation context, you have multiple land users. You have multiple actors, private sector, civil society, multiple government, spheres of government. We talk in South Africa about the spheres of government. And a lot of people have investigated this, and they investigated it also in a peace context. So Arthur Westing has done a lot of work in the Horn of Africa and also in Korea, in the Korean Peninsula, to see how environmental dialogue can bring about peace or can help resolve conflict. And it has done so. Ali edited a book in the early 2000s with plenty of examples from around the globe. More recently, the IUCN Panorama project is talking about the good examples of conservation, and it's mainly in Europe. And what I find interesting, I'll tell you in the next slide, is that Europe has a totally different approach to transfrontier conservation compared to Southern Africa. And then, of course, there is my own little experience in the region. So what are the lessons that I've learned, looking at research and looking at me? Well, first of all, there's two different approaches if we want to compare Europe to SADC. SADC, Southern African Development Community Area, all the countries involved, have always had a very top-down approach to Transboundary Conservation Initiative, meaning that two governments would get together and discuss the opportunity created around shared environmental resources and how to manage that, what kind of treaties to establish, what kind of government system to establish. So it worked out from the state down. And like I said before, that sometimes, often, resulted into conflict. Because when you engage only at a certain level and you forget about everybody else that sort of lives with the outcomes of your international decision making, then you're missing out, and then conflict comes out. Having said that, Southern African Development Community is the only regional body globally that has now a Transfrontier Conservation Area unit. So it's a dedicated unit within their Directorate for Food, Agriculture and Natural Resources, which already gives you an idea of where natural resources sit in the priorities of Southern Africa, that is dedicated to Transfrontier Conservation Areas, which is helpful, immensely helpful, because it brings all the practitioners, all the managers together to discuss what they're doing, what's happening, what is not happening, and how to move forward. And through this process, we are now arriving at the point where the Southern African TFCA unit is developing a set of guidelines for a whole heap of issues related to transboundary conservation areas, from the specific guidelines for the establishment and management to now the community engagement guidelines, tourism concession guidelines, tourism management guidelines, and then the monitoring evaluation framework that I did. So it's an interesting process whereby we started top down. We're now moving to a multi-stakeholder dialogue network building, and we're moving forward from there. In the EU, exactly the opposite. So we have the legal enabling environment to establish transboundary conservation areas. We have Natura 2000, we have the Interreg program, we have the Habitat Directive. So we have several instruments that help us in developing this kind of constructs. But interestingly enough, the critical successful examples of transboundary conservation initiatives have started from local communities. That is, villages, cities, areas, urban areas, living on a border of each other, getting together to say, we want to do this, to protect the environment that we share and to be able to use it in a sustainable manner. Which is very interesting because it brings down the element of the bottom-up approach. But of course, the social context between Europe and Africa is very different, especially if we look at border communities in the two areas. That said, there's a lot that can be learned. There's a lot that can be learned in helping us with the community engagement process in Southern Africa, and in moving forward, we're bringing in all the actors together. An element, again, brought to you by my student, Emma, is the existence of a new directive, which is the JECT. Don't ask me to spell it, just Google it, you'll find out. But the JECT is a legal instrument that allows, for the purpose of managing natural resources, it allows municipalities or local management authorities, local district management authorities, to get together and to form a space of natural resource management that can be outside of the national legal systems. Meaning, you have two communities across two borders that decide we want to protect this environment and create a transboundary conservation initiative. We use the JECT directive to create rules of engagement and rules of management of our own, regardless of what our country legislation says. Now, you can say whatever you want about the European Union. It's cumbersome, I agree. It's bureaucratic, I agree. It's sometimes very backward, I agree. But this directive sets, for me, a whole new dimension of the European Union, one that is daring, one that is finally probably able to delegate management of things to not only the countries, but the people that live in the country. Something that in many parts of the world would never happen. In many cases, even if you compare that to the federal states, the United States of America, there is not that freedom for people and local administrations to manage that much of what is very valuable, that is a natural resource. because we know how valuable they are. We have wars over it. We're going to have another one soon. So, and the other, in terms of comparative issues to Southern Africa, is that many people said to me while I was doing the monitoring evaluation framework, oh, but there is the Europark. Well, the Europark is not an instrument of the European Union, it is private sector. So yes, it brings about something really interesting, which is self-certification of transboundary conservation initiatives and all the rest of it, but it's private sector. SADC as its own Europark within a government-based agency, which I think can have a lot more strength in terms of deciding the future they want than a private sector initiative. But that's my own personal opinion. So what has transboundary conservation demonstrated so far in terms of building peace around the world? Well, in Europe, I think it has demonstrated that if people want to get together, they can, and they now have the legal framework to do it. In Southern Africa, it has demonstrated that it's important to use whatever method, whatever tool, whatever issue we have to bring about peace, which is a lesson that Europe may have to learn very fast and very soon. So let's take it in. In South Africa, it has worked. Yes, it was driven. It was driven by NGOs. It was driven by the political environment, which all of a sudden talked about sustainable development. All of a sudden had the Rio Convention. We then hosted one in Johannesburg. There was an international enabling environment for this to happen. But the bottom line is that if the governments of Southern Africa had not wanted it, it wouldn't. And right now, we wouldn't sit perhaps with all the conflicts that we had before, but we definitely wouldn't sit with the idea of a future whereby people and countries can get together to solve environmental problems that may otherwise become very poignant conflicts in the future. And this is, for me, and again, that's why I told you at the beginning, I dismissed the peace element when I started my research, but I was young and naive, and now I come back to it, because that is really what is important in a world where we have so much conflict, to bring a dialogue that talks about peace and uses any element, especially the elements that we know are going to be conflictual in the future, to talk about peace before that conflict even happens. So I've also had experience in disaster risk reduction. That's my disaster risk reduction mentality. Here it is. But how do we do it? Do we just leave it to the regions? Do we just wait to see what happens? Well, we can. Sometimes the natural processes, the organic processes, as we say, are the best. Sometimes they need a little push. And in fact, in my research about peace, it turns out that as much as states can bring about conflict, law can help to bring about peace, because it creates that drive. And we saw it. If we didn't have legal instruments in the past that talked about ecosystem, that talked about environment, that talk about local Agenda 21, we wouldn't have gotten where we are now. So maybe the time has come to have an overarching element in international law that specifically addresses the role of transboundary conservation in bringing together all the 4.5, I concede to CITES, existing legal documents into a framework that can help us to spell out what is the future we want that is just a declaration. Let's bring that into a formal legal instrument. And this is really why it's needed. We learned lessons from environmental law. We learned lessons from transboundary conservation initiatives. We even learned lessons from peace studies. We have it all there. It's challenging, of course, because A, we know very well in international law to have a new convention brings a whole new bureaucratic set of its own. And so the dispersal of funds, it's fantastic. But that's why we have the new generation of lawyers, right? To think laterally, to think cohesively, to bring new elements to the field. And so in my mind, the legal instrument should use a paradigm that is already existing. Let's bring together the strengths that we find in all the environmental conventions, declarations, treaties, that we find, let's bring them together and formalize them in something that tells us that if we want to move forward into the future, and if we want to really create an instrument that helps us to use nature as a peace-building process as opposed to a conflict process, this is the way we can go. And in terms of implementation, it has to provide for specifics. It has to target those elements that previous treaties and agreements and conventions didn't target. And that is specifically the multi-stakeholder engagement, multiple land use options, and frame conservation not as the overarching paradigm for sustainable use of natural resources, but vice versa. But bearing in mind that when we talk about sustainable use of natural resources, we don't just talk, a very emotional subject these days, about rhino horns and ivory. We talk about water. We talk about land. We talk about forestry. Talk about fisheries. Talk about a whole heap of ecosystem goods and services that help us to live on this planet, whether we are in a rural village in Southern Africa or on top of the Himalaya or in the city centre of Glasgow. So in my concluding notes, if we talk about a legal instrument, it has to be visionary. We need to go back to giving people a vision. We are scientists, we can see it. The politicians, Ban Ki-moon, can dish it out. But we need to have a vision whilst being realistic. We know the environment in which we operate. We are only human after all. We're not dancer. And it needs to be enforceable. Why? Because we know, law students, that a law is only as valid as it is enforceable. If you can't enforce it, forget it. Just a piece of paper. Nice one, but piece of paper. So we need to create that space, the vision with the reality of life, and also knowing that a piece of law can change. That's why we have annexes and conferences of the parties, right? To make sure that we follow on the process and make the real thing happen. And both of them need to target the enforceability. So this is my 2 pennies worth. If you think it's too qualitative and too based on I think and I believe and I've learned, I can direct you to a very nice research paper done by a PhD student, not one of mine, unfortunately, called The Bias ID, just came out. And he actually did, he's a geographer, pride. He did a qualitative research study. So he basically tried to analyze through statistical methods, all very verifiable, what was the real impact of transboundary conservation initiatives globally since 1946, and if and how they helped into peace-building processes between 2 or more countries. And I'm going to give you the spoiler. What he found out was that they do. Well, first of all, he found out that they're only valid in Southeast Asia and Africa. He had several criteria for understanding conflicts and things like that. Within Africa, not valid for the conflict between Sudan and Kenya. But that's because when the Multilateral Environmental Treaty for the creation of a Transboundary Conservation Initiative was done, Sudan, because of political issues, Idi Amin was still in power and all the rest of it was basically sidelined. So it was nominally in the treaty, but actively not. And so, of course, if you don't start talking, there's only so much that can happen afterwards. But everywhere else, the talks that were initiated to discuss shared environmental resources and the management thereof led or facilitated the resolution of conflict between 2 countries and led to discussions and opening up for peace-building strategies in other sectors as well. And Southern Africa, the Southern African Development Community, I think is the best example overall, although for some reason it didn't feature in his research and I'll talk to him about it. But it's the best example overall. we have Transfrontier Conservation areas. We're starting to see now how they impact. And yes, we have conflict, mostly brought about by outsiders. But we are starting to see a change. And that hopefully will carry into the future. Thank you.